Hello and welcome to our Lakeside chat. We are David Wofford and Katie Noonan, co-chairs of the Rotary Nature Center Friends. And we're so happy that you can join us tonight.
As we begin our program, it is important for us to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, that Lake Merritt is part of Ohlone territory. We hear now from Corinna Gould, spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn and co-founder of Segura Te Land Trust.
Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Corinna Gould. I am the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn. We are here today at what most folks think of as Lake Merritt. We are in the territory of Huichin. Huichin is actually a territory that encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Emeryville, Albany, and Piedmont. And so this is a place that my ancestors have been since the beginning of time. And this was a place of abundance. I'm so happy that people from all walks of life that now come into our territory can enjoy this beautiful place that my ancestors have enjoyed since the beginning of time. My relationship to the land that I have been born to, raising my children and grandchildren here, has been to tell the story, the truth of what happened on this land before other people came here. I'm hoping that as we begin to learn these lessons of fires in California, the pandemic that's happening, that human beings come back to living in reciprocity with the earth.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew McNeely. I'm a recent graduate from CSU East Bay, specializing in geography and GIS, and I have been volunteering with the Rotary Nature Center Friends at Lake Merritt since 2022. Specifically, I want to mention that the Rotary Nature Center Friends are not part of the Rotary Club and not part of the Rotary Nature Center. We're an independent 501c3. So I've been participating with the Rotary Nature Center Friends since 2021. And I've heard a lot from David and Katie about the philosophy and the early naturalists at Lake Merritt, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. But first, I'd like to share some experiences from our recent time at the GSA conference. That's the Geological Society of America in Sacramento, where we presented some of the community science projects we do. So first, I am speaking about dissolved oxygen in Lake Merritt.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leander McNeely, and this was the poster for dissolved oxygen here at the American Association for Geologists. I helped contribute to this data, the collection of dissolved oxygen around Lake Merritt before and after the hazardous algae blooms we saw in 2022. And this conference has been a really great experience for me to connect with geologists and other professionals in the field of land sciences and talk about our findings, as well as other ecosystems in the San Francisco Bay Area that are affected by things like plastic pollution, as well as other salmon populations. Thank you.
Yeah, so here are one of our posters. This one specifically talks about Chinook salmon in Lake Merritt, Oakland. It was a really interesting opportunity in terms of collecting the fish, even the process of determining whether it was Chinook or Coho salmon itself. And then, we still have a lot to go with the fish that are unclipped. We're super excited to see where our research takes us in terms of determining where they come from, using the isotope analysis. But yeah, it's super amazing to be here and represent the
Hello, my name is Richard. I'm currently at the 2025 Cordilleran Section GSA meeting in Sacramento. Today I'm presenting about the recovery from the harmful algal bloom that occurred in Lake Merritt in 2022. So we've been tracking the dock fouling species that are in Lake Merritt for a long time. And when the algal bloom occurred on August 28, 2022, we took the opportunity to observe and see the recovery underway. We saw that there was a rapid recovery of a lot of different species, but it was uneven across taxa and across different groups. And from this, we've been able to glean a lot of data. We saw that for a lot of the fish, they took a very long time to recover, whereas for a lot of the invertebrates, especially the small ones like nudibranchs, they recovered quite quickly.
And now I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Jim Covel. Jim Covel grew up around Lake Merritt, and his father, Paul Covel, was Oakland's first naturalist, as well as the first municipal park naturalist in the United States. He spent a lot of time following his father around on nature walks, attending interpretive presentations, as well as helping with tasks at the Rotary Nature Center in the Duck Pond. Jim followed in his father's footsteps and became a ranger and naturalist in the Sacramento area before then moving to Monterey and serving as the Director of Training and Interpretation at the Monterey Bay Aquarium for 34 years. I present Jim Covel.
Thank you. Jim, I'd like to hand it over to you. Are you ready?
I certainly am. Thanks, Katie. And welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us this evening. Hello, I'm Jim Covel, and for the next few minutes, I'd like to share a few stories with you about the early days of the Naturalist Program at Lake Merritt and the city of Oakland. I always like to start with this picture from the Tribune in 1919, showing a huge flock of ducks here at the lake. Just a reminder that really so much of what we've enjoyed around Lake Merritt, in fact, maybe the fact that we have a lot of Lake Merritt and Lakeside Park, really started with the ducks there. And that is our first story about the ducks. Because in 1915, there was one of the first oil spills in the San Francisco Bay Area happened in the estuary. And some of that oil floated into Lake Merritt, and it gunked up a lot of our ducks at Lake Merritt. And the city of Oakland was kind of shocked by that, and they felt sorry. A lot of those ducks didn't make it. And so with the loss of so many waterfowl because of that early oil spill, the city wanted to do something to help correct the damage, and so they voted some money to start buying grain to feed the ducks. So that started in 1915, and some of the jobs of the early gardeners at Lakeside Park was to feed the ducks every afternoon. Here's a picture from about 1932, and that features my father, Paul Covel, who was the first official naturalist at the city of Oakland. And on weekends, when they fed the ducks, Paul Covel would narrate that feeding and add an educational component to the whole thing. And you can see that became very popular. Look at the crowd that gathered from all around the city and beyond as people would gather down around the duck pond for the duck feeding every afternoon at 3:30. Here's another look from that 1930s view, and if you know your waterfowl at all, you'll notice that you're looking at a lot of pintail and widgeon there. They were a couple of the most common ducks in that era, and of course nowadays you probably won't see a widgeon at all around Lakeside Park, and very few pintail, because lots of things have changed around in the San Francisco Bay Area, including feeding or filling in a lot of the shallow wetlands around the edge of San Francisco Bay. That was the favorite feeding and resting areas for a lot of these ducks that like shallow water, like the pintail and the widgeon. So as the habitats changed around the San Francisco Bay, we saw fewer and fewer of those species, and so remarkable changes around the lake. I also want to point out that structure in the background, that pen, is the original banding trap at the lake, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. There's another view, one of our gardeners feeding the ducks in an afternoon, and that old banding trap in the background. Now, not all of those ducks like to come ashore. A lot of the ducks that liked deeper water or like to stay in the water, or ducks that just didn't want to get that close to people, would stay offshore. So part of the job of the feeder was to wade out on this little walkway out into the lake, and they would spread some of that grain out there for the ducks and the geese and the swans that you see there that didn't like to come ashore. So they would stay out in the water there, but we want to make sure that they had an opportunity to get a little food as well. You might also notice in the background there, you can see Duck Island 1 and 2 there. In 1925, they were building the Oakland Auditorium on the other side of Lake Merritt, and there was some fill that was left from that excavation, from that construction project. So they decided to fill in a little bit of an area and create an island for the ducks there, and that became the first of 5 duck islands. And the idea was to provide a place for the ducks and geese and other birds to rest offshore so they didn't have to uh, compete with people and dogs and other things that they might encounter when they were trying to rest onshore. And we'll revisit those duck islands a little bit later on as well. We were talking about that banding trap earlier. Here is a more recent version of that banding trap, and you can see how it operated. You can see there's one gentleman there by the gates on the left side there in the picture, and you can see a few birds that are trapped on the inside there. And the idea is during that feeding event, we could spread some grain inside that trap. A lot of the birds would run in after the grain, and we had quite a few birds inside that trap. Then we could drop these gates that are on the side that you see there, and they're trapped inside. And the next part of that job was to go in. Once the birds were trapped inside that large banding trap, the next step was to capture one bird at a time, try and pick them out of the crowd there, and quickly look to see if there was already one of those aluminum bands on the leg of the bird. And if so, that number would be noted, and that would be reported as a recapture. Sometimes we had ducks there at Lake Merritt that would come in every day into the banding trap just to get a meal, and they were captured many, many times. We probably didn't report all of those. And then there would always be a number of ducks and geese in there that hadn't been banded yet. And then they would be brought over to the banding station that was set up. So this is what we saw next. That bird would be brought to the banding station where it was measured and weighed, any other information we might note about that particular bird, and then one of those aluminum bands was attached to the leg of the bird, and it was released. This banding program was started by the federal government in 1920, and it was one of the first large nationwide research programs focused on waterfowl around North America, trying to learn more about their longevity and their migrations, and trying to gather a lot more data so we could understand our waterfowl populations a lot better. And that was all based on this banding program. In 1926, some local citizens in Oakland and Piedmont formed the first banding station there, and the government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, started to provide the bands, and we had a number of local citizens that were involved in banding there at Lake Merritt, and really established Lake Merritt as one of the first banding stations on the entire Pacific Flyway, and it maintained that status as a significant banding station for the next 30 years. It was quite an event when there was banding going on. There were a number of people that were involved in this process. Some people were capturing the birds, others were recording all the data, other people were doing all the measurements on each duck. It took a small army to do all this, especially given that they were often banding maybe a few hundred birds in a day. And over the course of the winter season, when we had most of the waterfowl coming through the lake, they might band several thousand birds per year. Now, there were a variety of waterfowl that really didn't come ashore. They were the diving ducks that like to stay out in open water, a little bit deeper water around Lake Merritt. And so they weren't represented in the early banding projects around the lake. So the naturalists got together and designed a different type of banding trap where we could bait it, again, usually with grain, and these diving ducks would swim into this banding trap that was out in the water, and then they couldn't escape again, and it was easy then to go in and net those birds and bring them ashore and band them. So we started to band large numbers of goldeneye and canvasbacks in particular were real focus, scaup, and a variety of these other diving ducks. It turns out that there were only one or two of these stations available on the entire Pacific Flyway for banding diving ducks. So Lake Merritt became the #1 banding station in terms of providing data on diving ducks for a number of years. All that information quickly added into quite a database for studying waterfowl, and every banding station would get information back from any of those bands that were recovered. So maybe years later, a hunter might shoot that duck or goose, or it might be found dead. If it had that aluminum band on its leg, that band number would be sent back to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Banding Center in Patuxent, and they would match that up with the original records from where that was banded, and that would then cycle all of that information, complete that cycle, so we knew what was going on with that bird. And then the banding station where it banded that bird would get that information back. So through the years, we got a number of those banding reports back to Lakeside Park and Lake Merritt. And this was the basis for an exhibit that we had on the wall for a number of years in the Nature Center, showing the different banding returns and the migratory routes that those birds were found on around North America. And a couple of the bands from geese that we had there, actually we got returns back from Siberia, and that was some of the first really solid evidence that some of these waterfowl actually jumped from one continent to another, when we started to see a few bands from Lake Merritt and other parts of California might turn up in Asia. I wanted to point out also, before we leave the feedings, that if you look at some of the birds that we had around there, you notice there are a lot of snow geese. Rarely see a snow goose around Lake Merritt now. You don't see, there's one or two Canada geese there. And of course, now we see lots and lots of Canada geese, largely because of a project that started there at Lake Merritt, bringing Canada geese back to the San Francisco Bay Area. And you can see a few pelicans there as well. So it's always an interesting mix of birds that turned up there at Lake Merritt. Here's one of my favorite stories about some black swans that lived at Lake Merritt for a number of years. It turns out that, and you may know that black swans aren't native to North America, they are Australian. And so what are they doing here? And it turned out that the city of San Francisco spent quite a bit of money to bring a few swans from Australia to San Francisco and put them in Golden Gate Park. Apparently, the black swans weren't entirely satisfied with hanging out there in Golden Gate Park, so they flew out into the San Francisco Bay and were paddling around, especially around the Treasure Island area. And so, of course, they were spotted very quickly out there. And somebody called my father, Paul Covel, at Lakeside Park and said, "Hey, there's some black swans out here in the San Francisco Bay." So my dad grabbed a little bit of grain and a net and a couple of sacks and went over to Treasure Island and found the black swans. And of course, they were fairly domesticated at that point. Put a little grain out. They eagerly came over to the grain. He scooped them up and brought them to Lakeside Park and Lake Merritt. And San Francisco found out about it, and they said, "Wait a minute, those are our swans. We paid for them. We want them back." And the city of Oakland said, "Well, you had a chance to get them. Nobody came to get them from San Francisco, so they're ours now. We got them." And so that went back and forth, mostly between the two newspapers. Fought that back and forth in the papers for a few weeks, and finally San Francisco said, "Nah, they're doing well at Lake Merritt. They seem to be happy. They can stay there." And they did stay here for probably another couple of decades. We also had white pelicans off and on through the years at Lake Merritt. here's one of my favorite pictures of one of our naturalists, Rex Burris, feeding some of our white pelicans. So, of course, there are white pelicans that migrate through the San Francisco Bay Area seasonally, and they might stop at Lake Merritt for a little snack of some fish out there. But also, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would bring injured pelicans to Lake Merritt, and these were birds that were non-releasable, and they really couldn't fly, so they could be safe and make sure they had a good meal regularly at Lakeside Park and Lake Merritt. And so over the years, we would have always a few resident pelicans that were there, and then seasonally, when pelicans were migrating through, they would also have visitors from the wild migrants that would stop and hang out there for a few days and join in a little fishing around the lake. So, and today we still have Hank, and then from time to time, Hank has some of those wild migrants that stop by the lake and join Hank. So this has been a tradition around Lake Merritt for many, many years as well. I mentioned earlier about those duck islands, and in 1958, the city decided to add some additional islands. That Duck Island number 1 was a very popular spot for a lot of the waterfowl as a resting area and then as a nesting area as well. So 4 more added islands were added as well. And this was sometimes fill from other projects around Oakland. Sometimes it was from dredging around the lake. But these other islands were built up. And each island had its own fresh water supply and a small little concrete basin. So there was fresh water available for the birds, as well as there would be some irrigation there to help get plants established around the islands. And through the years, I remember that was one of my jobs as a teenager, as a volunteer around the duck pond area, was to row out to these islands along with one of the gardeners. The park gardeners, there was always one gardener that was assigned to the islands as well, and one of the job was to go out there and clip things back a little bit. The vegetation had been so well established, it was overgrowing the islands, and so one of the jobs was periodically to trim things back and fill that boat with all of the trimmings from plants and row that back to the shore again where the trimmings could be picked up and disposed of. Here's a picture from probably about 1958, 1960, showing on the right, that's Duck Island number 1, and then towards its left, Island number 2 and Island 3, and there are 2 more islands past those out of the picture. You can also see that the geodesic dome has appeared in this picture as well, and that was another big addition in the 50s. There were some architecture students at UC Berkeley that had heard about a new design idea that Buckminster Fuller, a local actually a nationwide visionary futurist, was talking about building structures that didn't require any internal support. And this was a geodesic dome. The students heard about that and thought that's a pretty amazing idea, and they really were taken with that. And they thought, we should build one of those so everybody could see what a geodesic dome looks like. And they talked to Henry Kaiser from Kaiser Aluminum, and Kaiser agreed to donate the materials for this. And then Bill Mott, who was a visionary leader for parks in Oakland in the 1940s and 50s, Bill Mott heard about that and said, I have the perfect place for it and the perfect purpose for it. Let's build a geodesic dome around the duck pond area at Lake Merritt, and we can put birds in there that need to have the space to fly around without having to run into anything. So soon we had the geodesic dome, and we had families of sparrowhawks or kestrels that lived in there. There are a few other species of waterfowl in there, and it became quite a show place for a variety of birds that gained that joined the collection there at Lakeside Park. I need to introduce another person here that was really a very important founder in that naturalist program in Oakland. This is Brighton Kane, or everybody knew him as Bugs Kane. Bugs was actually an entomology student from Stanford, finished his graduate work at Stanford in 1925. The Bay Area Boy Scout Council hired Bugs Kane as the scout naturalist. And pretty soon, Bugs Kane was settled into a new little kind of a nature center that the scouts had built up in the Montclair area at a camp up there, about 28-acre camp of Diamond O. And that became a favorite spot for Boy Scouts and people all around Oakland. And of course, Bugs Kane had his collections of insects. Again, he was an entomologist, but he also was quite a herpetologist, had a lot of different snakes and lizards, and had specimens of birds and mammals and all kinds of plants there as well. And lots of Boy Scouts did their merit badge projects up there at Diamond Camp. And pretty soon, Bugs Kane was so popular not only amongst the scouts, but he started to do programs in some of the other parks around Oakland, and then to libraries and even schools. So while he was paid by the Boy Scout Council, he actually served as a naturalist in many ways all around the East Bay area. And he certainly was an important mentor for my father, Paul Covel, when he got started there in the 1930s around Lake Merritt. So from the feed duck program on the afternoons, and we were talking about that originally in the 1930s. My dad was doing these narrative programs about waterfowl when they were feeding the ducks at 3:30 in the afternoon there at the duck pond area. But then pretty soon people wanted more. And pretty soon schools were bringing classes down there to learn about Lake Merritt and the waterfowl. And so my dad was also starting to do those field trips for school groups. Now, the city didn't have the money to pay for a naturalist in the 1930s, and so I have to give a lot of credit to the Lake Merritt Breakfast Club. They actually raised the money to pay for these programs that my dad was doing starting in 1934, and that continued for a number of years forward until World War II started. And during World War II, of course, lots of things changed around the world and around the Bay Area. They actually had to interrupt the duck feeding program for a couple of years during World War II, and the naturalist program also stopped during that time. But as soon as World War II ended, then Oakland was eager to start up the feeding program again and the naturalist programs again. And by 1947, they had actually budgeted money in the city budget to pay a park naturalist. And so they hired my dad as the official park naturalist for the city of Oakland, and he became the first municipal park naturalist anywhere in the United States. So that was a brand new program. Now, remember Bugs Kane. I was talking about him earlier. And Bugs Kane had been working with the Scouts for 25 years until he died suddenly in 1950. And people were stunned. I mean, he was a beloved character around the East Bay area. And quickly people said, we need to do some kind of memoriam for Bugs Kane. And again, Bill Mott, the park superintendent for Oakland, said, it would be nice to continue his work. And of course, everybody knew about the Bugs house up in the Piedmont area on the camp. And so they thought, why don't we build a nature center? And I have the perfect location down here on the edge of Lake Merritt. We have a naturalist now, but the naturalist didn't have a place to work. My dad was working out of the gardener's shack there around the duck pond area, and it would be really nice for the naturalist to have like an office and some exhibits and a place where they could store their materials and collections, and we could also house the books and the specimens from Bugs Kane. Everybody loved that idea. A committee was organized to fund that. People donated from all around Oakland to donate money to that, and then the Oakland Rotary Club did the bulk of the fundraising to help build the nature center. And Bill Mott said, well, the city will donate the land. And Bill talked to a local contractor who said, well, if you can raise the money for the materials, I'll donate the labor to build it. So between that local contractor, the city of Oakland for the land, and the Rotary Club and lots of citizens around Oakland, this whole project came together. They launched it in 1952, and in September of 1953, they opened the Rotary Natural Science Center. And now the Naturalist Program had a home and a home base to operate from. And of course, schools were already coming for field trips to Lake Merritt. And so now we had a place to actually gather classes and start to do some programs as well as take people out in the field there. Here's Dave Farrow, one of the naturalists, in doing a little snake talk for a group of students that had gathered there inside the Nature Center. And every day there would be groups coming, sometimes several classes a day, coming down to the Rotary Natural Science Center for their field trips. And the program started to grow dramatically at that point. Now that they had a launch pad, they had a home base. Another big addition was adding wheels to the whole program. So in 1954, the city again budgeted some money to buy the first vehicle for the naturalists, and now they're able to take specimens and send some live animals to other parks and librarians and schools all around Oakland. So now the Naturalist Program was not only operating there at Lakeside Park, but also was covering the rest of the city. This was a popular program, especially in the summertime. Of course, they went to a lot of schools during the winter, but during the school, when there were school camps and the vacations from schools, they would go out to parks and recreation centers around the Oakland area and bring some specimens out there and do programs for kids that had been gathering there. In fact, here's one of those programs at Mosswood Park in the early days. And those programs reached beyond Lakeside Park and the downtown parks, but also up into Joaquin Miller Park. And here again, Dave Farrow is starting a nature walk with some students around the meadows at Joaquin Miller Park up in the hills. And that was another popular spot for nature walks. And that became a tradition that every Saturday morning there would be a nature walk with a naturalist in Joaquin Miller Park. Now, I've been talking about some of the animals also. Beyond just birds, there were a variety of other things that were part of the Naturalist Program. As the Naturalist Program got more and more popular and everybody around Oakland knew about the naturalists. So when people found orphans, and there was no wildlife rescue organization in the Bay Area back in those days, so people would bring orphans to the Nature Center and present them to the naturalist to, can you take care of this animal, raise it up, and find a safe home for it. Before there was a nature center, those animals would stay with the naturalist. A lot of those animals spent their evenings in our home when I was growing up, and then they would travel with the naturalist to programs and sites during the day. And Fairyland was one of those sites. Fairyland, of course, opened in 1950, about 3 years before we had the Nature Center. So oftentimes you'd see my dad and Fairyland showing off some of the animals that were brought into us. Here he is with a young screech owl who was brought into us. And I always think of this, especially this time of the year in May. Most years we had one or sometimes several fawns that were brought in. A couple of times wardens would find fawns where the mom had been killed, hit by a car, or whatever, and would leave an orphan fawn. And again, a game warden has too many duties to spend a lot of time taking care of a fawn, but it was a perfect match for our naturalists. And so those fawns would again travel around to some of the different parks and different programs until they were old enough to be released. So this was my growing up here in Oakland, because a lot of these animals need to have care 24/7. So they would go to work with my dad, and then when he came home from work, then he often brought those animals home with him, and we would be charged with caring for those animals in the evening and overnight and first thing in the morning until they went back to work with the naturalists again. So here I am chasing one of our fawns around the backyard in our house out in East Oakland. This is probably one of the favorite animals when I was very, very young. Actually, about the time I arrived, we also had Gus turn up here, and Gus was a porcupine that somebody had found as a orphan up in the Sierras, and for some reason they brought it back to Oakland. And so Gus the porcupine grew up with us, grew up with me, and until he was old enough to work to stay on his own in a cage that we had down at Lakeside Park. I always think about my mom. She was very patient with all of these things. She didn't mind having all these animals around the house. She did complain a little bit when Gus chewed on some of her furniture legs. And but Gus was so darn cute, you couldn't really get mad at him. From time to time, we would have orphan skunks as well. You know, the mom would get hit on the road, and there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 skunk kits that were little orphans. And fortunately, when they're that young, they didn't really feel threatened, and so they could safely be in the house. They like to hang out behind the refrigerator in our kitchen because of all the warmth coming off the refrigerator. And so some of the other animals that used to hang out, and my mother didn't mind sharing her kitchen with the skunks. And of course, there were always raccoons, and lots of orphan raccoons have come through the Nature Center through the years. And again, they would come home at night, and this was often the first thing that met me in the morning when it was time for me to get up and go to school, and it was time for the raccoons to get up and go to work with the naturalists. And a lot of times that was my alarm clock first thing in the morning, was these young raccoons that were crawling around me. Of course, we had a lot of people visitors also, not just the different kinds of animals that turned up there at Lakeside Park, but lots of other people. And as the word of the naturalist program, and of course all of the kinds of interesting birds that turned up at Lake Merritt, We had a lot of people from traveling around the country and around the world that came here to look at the birds around the lake. This is one of my favorite pictures uh, of Roger Torrey Peterson, who was a very famous artist of birds and started the Peterson Field Guide series. And he would come to the West Coast every year or two and would often stop in Oakland and take a few pictures and visit the waterfowl. It's always something my father looked forward to seeing him turn up at the lake and talk about the latest developments in birding there. But there are lots of other people through the years, and we talk about all the waterfowl and the wildlife at Lake Merritt, but I also remember for the naturalists, it was also about the people that were there. There were a lot of people that were residents in Oakland that spent their days around Lake Merritt. There were people that were regulars every day there at the lake that would come down and they had their favorite bird. Sometimes they would feed a duck or two, but they just enjoyed spending their time with the wildlife out there, and they help us all keep an eye on things and make sure that things were going well around Lakeside Park also. Of course, the naturalists struck up friendships with a lot of those regulars around the lake. And so earlier I was talking about all the animals that my dad would bring home. He also brought people home from Lake Merritt. And so a lot of times my mom would get a call and say, I'm bringing a couple people home for dinner. So put a couple extra settings at the table. And my mom was a great cook, and she always had enough food for whoever turned up. My dad would bring home some of the regulars from around the lake, or sometimes he would meet travelers from around the world that had turned up there at Lakeside Park, and they would start to chat. The next thing he'd say, oh, why don't you come home and join us for dinner? And so we often had dinner guests from all over, all coming home from Lake Merritt. And that was part of what the naturalists did. It wasn't just about the wildlife. It was about all the people that enjoyed that park, and that they were part of the work of a naturalist, was to make sure that they were looking out for the people also, and making sure that people always felt connected to the park, to the wildlife, and to the community here in Oakland. And I'd like to end with this photo, which is much more recent, of the reopening of the Rotary Nature Center. As you may know, the city, because there's been a variety of budgetary constraints they have had to close the Nature Center at times. There was a fire that threatened to burn the building down a couple of years ago, and fortunately, again, one of those regulars that spends a lot of time keeping an eye on the park noticed that fire, reported it within a couple of minutes, and the fire department was here and to put it out and minimize the damage. That has been repaired. The Nature Center is back in good shape, new coat of paint, and a new staff of naturalists, and it's starting to make its emergence again. And it's so exciting to see things starting to pick up again, and to see life breathing back into that naturalist program that started so many years ago around Lake Merritt, and will come back to serve the community of Oakland here going forward. So lots of more stories to come from this, but now you know a little bit about the background, some of the important things that have happened with the naturalist program through the years. If you like more, my dad wrote a book called People Are For the Birds, which is a collection of his stories of the early days of Lake Merritt and the naturalist program, and some of the animals and some of the people through the years. And that book has been out of print for many, many years, but I'm happy to say that it looks like we're going to be able to make that available again in both an ebook and a paperback volume again. So stay tuned for more news about People for the Birds if you're interested in learning more about these stories from the early days at Lake Merritt. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed the stories and look forward to telling you more stories in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone. We're pausing our program now to give some credits and thank yous to everyone who's made our program possible. First of all, we want to thank you for coming and want to see you in June. We'll send out an invitation to our next Lakeside chat, free and online. We want to remind everyone that Rotary Nature Center Friends is an independent, all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit since 2021. The focus of our activities is community science and environmental justice. Our board of directors includes scientists, community activists, teachers, artists, and people, students, and people who are interested in community and Lake Merritt. We would like to thank the City of Oakland, Channel 10 K-Top TV for rebroadcasting our Lakeside Chat programs. The first 2 Sundays of the month, a selection of older programs is broadcast between 6 and 7 p.m. The last 2 Sundays of the month, K-Top broadcasts the current month's Lakeside Chat. We want to thank the Elks, Lodge number 3 in San Francisco for generous beacon and gratitude grants, which have made possible our education and community building activities and also our Lakeside Chat online programs. Thank you to New Voices Are Rising and the Rose Foundation for Communities and the Environment for providing financial support, inspiration, and amazing externs and school year water justice fellows. We thank the Lake Merritt Breakfast Club for a grant which allowed us to update and post native plant signs and bird signs along the pedestrian path at Lake Merritt. Do you enjoy what we do? Well, please consider making a donation to Rotary Nature Center Friends. You can do so on our website by using the donation button, or you can mail a check to Rotary Nature Center Friends. Here is a wish list of some of the things that we need to continue and expand our program. We need grant writing expertise because funding community science can be expensive, social media and website expertise, nonprofit expertise. We need docents and volunteers in the field to help set up and develop programs and events and work days. So contact Katie if you would like to help. What's coming up next? In the coming months, on Friday, June 6th, we have the next Lakeside Chat online and free. We will be featuring organizer and one of the co-founders of Salsa at the Lake, Isaac Koss-Reed. So look for that Eventbrite sign up to be sent soon. The California Academy of Sciences is hosting a Snapshot Cal Coast BioBlitz event all of June. Lake Merritt is in fact part of the California coast and has participated for several years in this event. On Friday, July 11th, Lakeside Chat 56 will be an update of Reflections on Lake Merritt, a feature film that's being made by filmmaker Brandon Jordan. On Friday, August 8th, we will hear from Dr. Amy Borges from the Laney College Biology Department speaking about decolonizing the college biology curriculum. We are planning tentative salmon dissection and Adopt a Spot mornings in the marsh. The dates will be communicated on our Facebook page. As primary stewards of Lake Merritt Wildlife Refuge, the Rotary Nature Center Friends regularly hosts school groups and members of the general population at Lake Merritt. If you are interested, contact us. We'd like to thank our producer, Rob Lamone, Katie Noonan, and David Wofford, our co-chairs. Kirsten Furman has provided art and design work. And we have a host of wonderful helpers and volunteers that make our program possible. Thank you so much for coming. Now let's get back to some Q&A and discussion about with Jim Covel about environmental program, natural history program at Lake Merritt. Thank you. Do we have questions, actually? We could take questions, right? Yes.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Okay, so raise your hand. Raise your hand if you have a question, and we will call on you.
And there's actually one question in chat that I can start with here. Question more about the white pelicans that would visit the lake. And so the pelicans that we had at the lake that were part of our regular bunch there that were non-releasable, those had been brought here by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And because they were non-releasable, I'm not sure if they were banded or not, because they probably weren't going to contribute that much to our study of migrations of the pelicans, because they weren't going to go anywhere. So I know the Fish and Wildlife Service was banding white pelicans up at Pyramid Lake on the nesting grounds up there. And so the migratory pelicans that came to the Bay Area may have been banded up at Pyramid Lake or elsewhere inland. But we didn't capture those birds, and they didn't come to the feeding that we had, where you see with Rex burris feeding the pelicans. Those are known pelicans, and they stayed at the lake. So the migratory pelicans, unless they were a casualty or they were recaptured, we never got that information because they weren't banded at the lake. So that's a long answer for saying I really don't know. There's kind of an assumption that the white pelicans that we see, I see them at Elkhorn Slough pretty regularly. We see them in the South San Francisco Bay Area. And I think there's an assumption that they come from eastward. And so seasonally, they will move towards the coast and back away from the coast. But we didn't gather any of that information at Lake Merritt, because the pelicans we had were, like I said, they were casualties. They weren't part of a larger banding program that the Fish and Wildlife Service was carrying on. Does that make sense?
I was reading, Jim, online a report by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration about decline of birds worldwide, and about how bird species that are nowhere near people are experiencing a decline. And I know that we've seen a decline at Lake Merritt. It's been remarked on the numbers of birds, not so much species, but numbers. Can you kind of comment on that, and maybe how that might be more important now than ever to provide those amenities for the birds that do visit Lake Merritt in terms of, water and decent habitat?
Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned that earlier when we started to look at birds, and we've been counting birds at the lake. I've got some of the early Audubon Christmas census counts from the 1930s there at the lake, and they were counting waterfowl there in the thousands there, at least, on the lake. And that really reflects changes that have happened around San Francisco Bay. As I mentioned, the habitat has been altered so dramatically all around the San Francisco Bay Area that a lot of those birds have moved to other parts of the Pacific Flyway, or they're just not utilizing San Francisco Bay because it's not the same kind of habitat that it used to be. And then through the years, we have had um, drought conditions that on the nesting grounds for birds that has had big impacts on that. There have been episodes of diseases that are probably endemic. I mean, that's a problem that waterfowl have had throughout time. But I know at Lake Merritt through the years, I can remember episodes with fowl cholera and botulism E and duck enteritis, and of course the avian flu. Um, and there have been a few episodes of avian flu. The current episode is particularly um, spread so easily that it's doing a lot of damage. So those kinds of things are always happening to birds, just natural disease episodes. But then we humans have such a huge power to alter the habitat. And then when we add some of the chemicals that we add to the environment that gets into the food webs for these birds, um, then you can start to see very easily why their numbers aren't just bouncing up and down, they are declining. And we've seen that with songbirds across North America. Um, Waterfowl populations go up and down, but they have been trending downward for quite a while. And then, of course, some of the things that we are looking at now with the impacts of more droughts and more changes in the climate, um, that's going to be additional stress on bird populations. So I'm afraid that those of us who have been watching birds for a few decades have certainly noticed that the numbers go up and down, but across time, they seem to be going more often than they're going up.
We have two really good questions here. Nan is curious about the bat species that were present in the period of time that you were there at Lake Merritt.
And there are probably at least 2 or 3 species that would come through there, but the species that we found most often, and again, people would bring bats into my father, were the myotis bats, the common kind of house bat that you might see in old structures around the area seasonally. And of course, a lot of our bats tend to leave here in the cooler months, but during the spring and summer and fall, um, we used to have pretty good populations of bats here and there where there were good roosting areas for them. But once again, feeding primarily on insects, and we've done a lot of things to control insects, some of which can affect bat populations, as well as some diseases that have been affecting bats. But I know the myotis bats, we used to have those. We had a few of those orphans come in, and we had them, believe it or not, we had bats living in the water heater closet in our uh, outside of our kitchen for a while. And my dad would put out some insects at night in the kitchen, and they would come out and fly around the kitchen and feed on things, and then uh, retreat to the water heater closet during the day. And so I know we had at least those species around. There was, by the way, a couple of scientists at the Cal Academy of Sciences over in San Francisco kept bats in their offices for years at a time, studying the bats. And so I think that's where my dad got some of his tips about if we have a bat that needs a short-term housing, how to keep bats happy for a while. And of course, rabies have always been a challenge with bats too, but for some reason we didn't seem to pay a lot of attention to that in those days. But whenever we're talking about bats, I need to warn people that our bat populations have endemic rabies. The bats carry it. And so you don't want to have any close contact with any species of bat that you find here.
So that would be a fascinating lakeside chat. Apparently, people have on iNaturalist have recorded bats in bringing the frequency down to a range where people could hear, and identifying different species that by what they could hear as opposed to just seeing them or whatever. That would be, it's just so much to explore natural history wise in Lakeside Park and in the city. Let's see, any more questions? Please raise your hand. I wanted to ask you about the bird ponds, as you're somebody who actually did a lot of work on them while you were at Lake Merritt with your dad, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And do you have any thoughts about how we might be able to provide water for the waterfowl? I believe we're heading into the summer. There's global warming is happening, and we're gonna have some very thirsty birds out there.
Yeah, one of the things about water, and of course, a lot of these waterfowl can drink salt water to some extent, and they can excrete the salt from that and utilize the fresh water. But over time, they do need some access to fresh water. And that was why we always had small freshwater ponds on each of the duck islands, as well as the duck pond itself that was fresh water. The thinking was always that it would be helpful to have access to some good fresh water. That was particularly important if we happen to have some of the disease epidemics that would hit waterfowl at times. And if they had access to cold, fresh water, that might help. For example, in episodes of botulism and things like that, that they might be able to have more resistance to that. So I think that's still something that it should be part of the mix of providing access to water for waterfowl and other birds in general. And of course, the big concern is anything you do like that, you have to balance that against attracting large numbers of waterfowl and concentrating them in one place where they can transmit avian flu back and forth. So it's like, that's the balancing act. You want to provide the right access to water and food for them, but at the same time, you don't want to concentrate them. But I think that's a balancing act we have to keep experimenting with to see, what can we do to provide for both sides of that equation.
Thank you.
I see another question here about conservation challenges, the coexistence with bird populations and park users. And yeah, I mean, that's always been, and I think Lake Merritt is a great ongoing case study in that. We have traditionally, like we used to have huge numbers of widgeon that come to Lake Merritt, and they came there primarily to eat all the grass that the gardeners grew around the park. And to this day, we still have the Canada geese that their primary source of protein is new growing grass. And so they are grazing whenever they can. And a lot of times, those are the same places where people want to picnic or walk around or walk their dogs. And so that's, trying to look at the patterns of when people utilize the park and utilize the lake versus when the birds utilize time and space there. And sometimes birds are active early in the morning before it gets busy with people. For many years, we were very careful about where boats were used on Lake Merritt versus areas that were set aside resting for waterfowl. We had a pretty good recipe for that with a log boom across the lake that would divide it into the boat part of the lake and the bird part of the lake. But I think a part of that mix also is just educating park users and realizing that they share that space with some other very special things there, the birds, the waterfowl, and the other birds around Lake Merritt. And I think if we're aware of that and maybe how we can be a little bit more considerate of the needs of some of those other things that share that space with it, um, I think people like to have the presence of wildlife around them. And if we know how to behave um, so that we can accommodate the needs of the wildlife also, we can all use that space. And we just have to be a little bit more aware of how to use that successfully.
Thank you.
I think that was a big part of what the naturalists did there, talking about all the other things that live in the park and helping people be good park users and allowing some space for the wildlife there.
So Jim, I mean, one of the things that I think is I'd like to know. I know a little bit about the pre-pandemic days, but what was the day like for a naturalist like your dad, and what kind of a presence was there at Lakeside Park? How did the staff interact with people on a moment-to-moment basis with out of that nature center?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you know, um, Lake Merritt, that area always had a lot of regulars. There were quite a few people that spent their day at around the duck pond. They would come down, they'd feed the pigeons, they would um, watch all the other people walking around. They would interact with some of the small animals that we had there. Uh, there were programs going on a almost daily basis in the nature center, so people would come into those programs. So we had the kind of the one layer of the regulars that were there all the time. And then we had other people that maybe from around the community or maybe from around the world that came to Lakeside Park to see the lake and the birds and experience the programs there. And so the naturalists, that was a big part of the job there, was just spending time not only around doing programs in the nature center, and of course, those programs are also spread all around Oakland. So we had for many years, we had a regular staff of 4 people there. So we always had 1 or 2 people around Lakeside Park and specifically around the nature center, while we could have a couple of other people that were out in parks and schools and doing programs around the rest of Oakland. Um, so depending on what you were doing on any particular day, you were in one of those rotations, either on outreach kinds of things or just interacting with people around the lake. And of course, the regulars there always kind of kept an eye out on to make sure that everybody was uh, taking good care of the waterfowl and the birds and the wildlife around there. So that was helpful to have a lot of eyes going on there to make sure that nobody was doing anything they shouldn't around that area. But it was different every day. And I remember, um, my father had an interesting um, part of his philosophy was that he was there not only to take care of the wildlife, but to take care of the people that utilized that park. And I know nobody would do that nowadays, but my dad used to bring people home for dinner all the time. He would meet an interesting person at the park, and he would invite them home for dinner. And my mother not only put up with all the animals that he brought home, but she also then would set another setting or two around the dinner table for anybody that he brought home um, from the lake by way of humans that he brought home. And sometimes those were some of the regulars that would show up for dinner, and sometimes they were international visitors that he struck up a friendship with, and he would bring them home. So, you know, part of the naturalist job is not just the wildlife, it's really looking out for the people that are using these parks also. And I think that's sometimes that gets overlooked. But I tell you, as a kid, I met a lot of fascinating people that would show up at dinner time.
It's amazing. I wanted to ask you about, we know you mentioned the generosity of the Rotary Club and the Breakfast Club in the start. How did the maintenance of the effort get funded as time went on? And what was the role of volunteers in keeping the nature center doing what it wanted to do?
Yeah. So, of course, everybody was volunteers for a while, and it wasn't until about 1947, actually, the city of Oakland had money on the payroll to actually pay a naturalist to be there. And then eventually that grew into 5 or 4 staff there at the nature center. But there were always volunteers. We talked about all the people that helped with banding birds. We had a variety of young volunteers that actually that program started at the old Oakland Museum in the 1940s with teenagers that helped out with programs around um, the old Oakland Museum. And when the Rotary Nature Center opened, that program moved from the Oakland Museum to the Nature Center. And so there was a group of young, well, teens that, and I was one of those folks. We did everything. We helped clean up, certainly cleaning cages and helping to prepare food for the birds and the other animals that we kept there. Uh, we went around to help with programs in parks and nature walks and so on. I can remember helping to show off skunks and snakes and opossums and so on while my dad was entertaining people at libraries and day camps. And a lot of those students through the years really got hooked on this business. Certainly, it was, I spent the rest of my working life as a naturalist and a ranger. And of course, I always um, talk about Jim Carlton, who was started out as a high school student from Piedmont High School, and he started hanging out at Lakeside Park, looking at all the invertebrates that hung out in the mud flights and so on around the lake. And before he graduated from high school, he had identified a couple of new kinds of invertebrates there at Lakeside Park. And of course, he became, a world authority on invasive invertebrates around the San Francisco Bay Area. And all of that started out as a teenager, helping out with some of the programs and some of the chores around Lakeside Park. So volunteers have always been a big part of getting things done around there. And even if the paid staff could have done all that work, and certainly they worked really hard, but they also believed that they needed to be nurturing that next generation of naturalists. And a lot of those people became naturalists and related professions as we grew up. And so that was another part of that philosophy of paying it forward.
Thank you. We have 2 questions coming in from John. How big of a problem was the discharge of trash from the city storm system during the time your father worked as a naturalist at the Nature Center?
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we had every time there would be a storm, we would get a storm of trash that would wash into the lake. And of course, it would eventually we had booms around a couple of those inflows into the bay. And so anything that floated there would be collected at the booms, and we had access to several boats that would go out and collect that trash. But also we started to see more and more instances of pollution coming down those storm drains. And there are a couple of episodes that my dad talked about, and I witnessed um, birds that were getting coated with road oil and um, other pollutants that would gunk up the plumage on these birds. And so one of the other things we had to do periodically was, after a storm, um, try and identify birds that had been covered with oil and tar, and gather those up. And I think probably at Lake Merritt, some of the first experiments on how can we clean uh, waterfowl were done there. And there was an episode in the 1960s when they were building the MacArthur Freeway, that there was a large spill of a sealant from the pavement that they were installing on the new freeway. And that ran directly into Lake Merritt, and there were hundreds of ducks that were gunked up um, during that episode. And there was a large scale cleaning effort that went on with that. We learned quite a bit from that. The birds, the success rate wasn't that great, but that was really the foundation of a lot of what we learned about how to treat uh, waterfowl and seabirds uh, with oiled plumation.
Wow, I guess that problem certainly hasn't gotten a whole lot better.
No, I'm afraid it's probably gotten worse.
We have another question from a naturalist point of view. What would you like to see done differently for the avian populations at the lake?
Uh, you know, things have so much changed. Personally, I miss the old duck feeding, but I realize there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't happen any longer. But that was just such a big tradition in the community. I still miss that. If there was some way to still bring the waterfowl closer to the audience and use that as an opportunity to educate people about waterfowl and about the wildlife at Lake Merritt and others, I think that was a great occasion, educational occasion there. And if there was some other way to accomplish that, I think that would be still a very, very popular thing in around Lake Merritt. Um, and yeah, I don't know. In terms of other things for the avian population, um, a lot of the changes are really based on what has happened in the region. Um, we miss seeing the birds. I haven't seen a widgeon at Lake Merritt in years. I haven't seen more than a handful of pintail. We used to have tens of thousands of canvas beak back around that area, and just see a handful of them now. So I realize the mix has changed and the numbers have changed. That isn't the lake, that is the whole of the San Francisco Bay region that has changed. And so I guess the big picture is, if we wanted to do more for the avian population around Lake Merritt, we would do more for the avian population around California. And so supporting our conservation efforts, supporting our wildlife refuges up and down the state. We're expanding those refuges. This is going to sound odd, but I think we also should try and support Ducks Unlimited nowadays, because Ducks Unlimited is actually one of the larger waterfowl conservation organizations, and there are fewer hunters and more bird watchers in Ducks Unlimited. So with the Bird Alliance and the other Audubon chapters. I mean, there are a lot of nonprofits as well as agencies that are working on waterfowl and wildlife in general, and they need our support. And I think the good work they do, we'll see around California, and that will be reflected at Oakland as well. And I think just keeping the lake clean and keeping it available for waterfowl is always important.
I know from Rotary Nature Center friends at Lake Merritt, we've noticed that when we're out quite a bit at the lake, and we have conversations with people who come by, and there seems to be a real hunger among people to understand more about the birds, and not just as exhibits for them to enjoy, but what's going on in the world that's affecting them, because it's really global. Issues like global warming, decline of biodiversity, habitat destruction. These are all feeding into what we're seeing at Lake Merritt. I've kind of thought in terms of having some of our members just kind of hang out, by the islands or something, and talk to people, to share some of, a little more depth than they see immediately just seeing a pretty bird at the lake. But I think there's a need for expanding that, and there's certainly a lot of people who can provide that. It's not that would be a good thing to do. Let's see, it's getting late here. Let's see, we have this has been a really awesome digression. Actually, I had a chance to talk in depth about these issues. So let's see, do we have any more questions? We go to, we're 18 people. We all fit on one
Everybody's been
screen.
very patient here this evening.
Oh, everybody loves the lake, and the need for programming is big. It's kind of sad to see the kind of lack of availability of the kind of vibrant programs that were provided by and developed at the Nature Center for whatever reason. But it's really, I think it's really been a good conversation. So let's see. We want to thank you. Here it is. We had our chat, our screens hacked and everything, and here we are having a great conversation, and it's 8:37. You've been wonderful, Jim. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Jim and Katie, before we go, I'll ask are there any anecdotal stories about a role Lake Merritt may have played as it developed, or the refuge there and the work there, in terms of having a statewide or national impact on Yosemite or Yellowstone or some other, as the whole process unfolded of environmental stewardship and conservation and
So, I can say, and thank you, David, because I think that's a good point. Oakland had the first wildlife area, first wildlife refuge. It had the first municipal park naturalist, and it had the first urban nature center. And all of those were brand new things. And the mayor, the city council, Bill Mott, who was the park superintendent, as they talked to leadership in other states and cities around the country, they would brag about Lake Merritt and what an amazing Lake Merritt, what the program was, and of course having a beautiful lake in the middle of a beautiful city, and so lots of other cities and state leaders came to Oakland, and they looked at what we did at Lake Merritt and including the naturalist program. And within the next few years, we started to see urban nature centers and urban interpretive programs all around the country. And a lot of those were based on the idea that people got from visiting Lake Merritt. So, and I also have to give a little credit to Bill Mott, who was pivotal in establishing this program with the city. And then when he moved to East Bay Regional Parks as their leader, then he really beefed up their interpretive program. And then when he moved to the director of California State Parks, he really beefed up their program. And then when he became the national park director, he made sure there was good support for their interpretive program. So in a way, David, going back to your question, some of just the good examples that started out at Lake Merritt really did have a national impact in several different ways, and something we should all be proud of as citizens of Oakland.
Wow. If I were a young undergraduate looking for something to do for my graduate work, I might make a focus on taking a look at along his way from municipal to regional to state to federal, what Bill Mott, the type of administrations and policies that came out of that, and see if I could draw an interesting correlation there. So fascinating. Thank you so much.